I'm going to talk a little bit about Asperger's and special snowflake. So what is a special snowflake, or special snowflake syndrome? Special snowflake syndrome is a made-up term, really, to describe people with Asperger's, and also people who don't have Asperger's, who believe that people with Asperger's are extra special, that they have abilities that neurotypicals don't have, and that this makes them highly intelligent. The idea, basically, that Asperger's is synonymous with geek syndrome, or that Asperger's is synonymous with having technical, scientific abilities, being really good at maths, or engineering, or computing. So basically, a serious disability is reduced to a personality quirk, and something that is actually an asset. What I want to demonstrate in this video is basically Asperger's is a serious disability, and it should be treated as such. And the reality of having Asperger's, which is not a game in the park, it's a serious condition that affects every aspect of one's life, and it doesn't actually, I'm speaking for myself, but the reality is I would imagine that the vast majority of people with Asperger's actually don't have special abilities. I think the statistics cited by the NHS is only 1 in 200 people with autism have special abilities, depending, of course, on what you mean by special abilities. People with what I call special snowflake syndrome often brag or go on about the special abilities that people with Asperger's have, or supposedly have. They think that Asperger's somehow confers advantages, and that they wouldn't have these advantages if they didn't have Asperger's syndrome. So the question is then, does autism give you abilities? Can it enhance certain skills? On one level, you could argue that yes, it does. As an example, I learnt to read very, very early before I started school, and when I was 10 years old, my reading ability was said to be that of a 15-year-old. So, in other words, I could read very complicated books designed for 15-year-olds. So, looking at this in sort of isolation, out of context, you might think, wow, that's amazing. Asperger's has given me special ability. But I would like to say that this argument is flawed. Firstly, people without Asperger's, neurotypicals, can also have excellent reading abilities. There's nothing unique to having Asperger's that gives you excellent reading ability, as neurotypicals can also often have great reading skills. So I would argue that that's actually just part of one of my strengths, if you like, the fact that I've got comparatively good verbal skills. If I didn't have Asperger's, I would still have those verbal skills. It is true that Asperger's has possibly enhanced some of that ability. So if you look at the reading ability, it's possible. Of course, it's impossible, as I say, to do to know for sure, because that's impossible. But it's possible that having Asperger's has meant that my mechanical reading ability, certainly as a child, was enhanced. But does that compensate for the disability? I would argue no, it doesn't. Because you have to look at the whole context, you have to look at the whole picture. So okay, I could read really well, I could read at the level of a 15-year-old at the age of 10. But I didn't have comprehension. My comprehension ability was not commensurate with my mechanical reading ability. My comprehension level was that of an 8-year-old when I was 10 years old. Whereas a neurotypical, if they could read at the level of a 15-year-old, it is highly likely that they would also have a comprehension of a 15-year-old. So my skills were highly uneven. So therefore, I would argue that this so-called ability, what looks like ability, is actually misleading. It actually is part of a disability. Because this skill in isolation, being able to read really, really well, it means nothing unless you can utilise that skill. It means nothing unless it's an integrated skill. In isolation, being able to read really, really well is not really going to help you if you don't have a comprehension to go with it. And I would argue that many of the so-called strengths of Asperger's are actually not really strengths, because they're fragmented skills. I'm not being defeatist here. Of course, people with Asperger's have strengths. We all have strengths. All human beings have strengths, and we all have weaknesses. But it's about understanding that you've got to look at the person as an individual, and the Asperger's is the disability. The Asperger's is what leads to disadvantage. It's something I have to fight every day. It's not easy. The abilities I have, the strengths I have, are part of me. They've got nothing to do with the Asperger's. If I didn't have Asperger's, I'd likely also have these strengths. If I didn't have Asperger's, yes, it's possible that as a 10-year-old my reading ability might not have been so advanced. It's possible. But I would certainly have had a more integrated ability, which would have meant more, and would have helped me more when I was at school than having this massive spiky profile, which actually wasn't very helpful. So that's what I want to argue. Now, another bone of contention, something else that is a major bugbear of mine, is the neurodiversity movement, which sounds progressive. This idea that autism is really just part of a wider sort of diversity. For example, in the same it's part of wider diversity, like being gay, or that is not really. That's all it is. It's just a difference. It's a difference. It's not a disability. This idea, and people who argue along the lines of neurodiversity often, as I say, they brag about the skills that Asperger's allegedly gives them, which I've argued actually is a load of bunkum, because Asperger's I don't think confers any advantages. But not only that, they also argue that people without Asperger's, so-called neurotypicals, actually have deficits themselves. So they're kind of like turning it on its head, as it were, making out as though we all have deficits, and that there's nothing, and therefore Asperger's isn't really that serious. It's just part of general diversity. So they might go on about, say, neurotypicals being socially obsessed, highly distracted, and having a deficit of attention to detail, making it out as though neurotypicals also have a disability. Well, if you wake up and smell the coffee, you can see the problems in this argument. It's so blatantly obvious that there is nothing disabling about being neurotypical, that having Asperger's is a disability. This trivialises Asperger's. And not only that, there are many people with Asperger's who actually don't meet the stereotype of being really good at detail and all the rest. Many people with Asperger's are highly distracted. I mean, I think it's upwards of 75% of people with Asperger's have some problems with attention, which by definition means you're going to be highly distractible. And also, many people with Asperger's have obviously sensory difficulties, which again is going to mean you're highly distracted. People with Asperger's who have dyspraxic elements or dyspraxic traits are going to find it hard to pay attention to detail. So not all people with Asperger's are super good at detail. Yes, there is a significant, it has to be said, all stereotypes have a grain of truth, that there are a significant number of people with Asperger's who are very good at detail, but they're not representative of everyone with Asperger's. You always have to start with the individual. And also, attention to detail can be a highly specific thing. So, if I'm pursuing an interest, for example, something I'm really, really interested in, I could pay attention to the minutest of details. I can get drawn into the detail and lose sight of the bigger picture, which isn't actually always helpful. I would argue that that's not really a strength, it's actually a disability, because I lack the ability to zoom out sometimes and look at the whole. Whereas a neurotypicals can be very good at detail as well. Being good at detail isn't an essentially autistic thing, but what is an essentially autistic thing is not being able to see the wider picture. So neurotypicals actually have the best of both worlds. They can see for detail, but at the same time, they can zoom out and see the bigger picture. Obviously, it's possible that autistic people, maybe some autistic people, not all, have a really good ability with detail. You know, are really, really detailed. And that's probably because they can't see the bigger picture, and they're only seeing a detail. This then becomes something that is enhanced. But something that is enhanced isn't necessarily an ability. I would argue that actually not being able to see the bigger picture is a disability. So a so-called strength doesn't really amount to much here. And also the idea that neurotypicals are socially obsessed and autistics aren't is also a load of bunkum. Because again, all autistic people are different. In actual fact, people with Asperger's can be very, very socially obsessed, and it can actually become a disability in itself. Because it's a different type. Okay, admittedly, neurotypicals are, as a rule, in general, tend to pay more attention to the social world. That's why, certainly as children, that's why they develop these social skills by a process of osmosis, because they're just naturally attuned to the social world. But autistic people, despite finding it very, very difficult to be social and to learn these social rules, can end up becoming very socially obsessed because of the awareness that you're different can actually make you feel kind of a bit paranoid sometimes. Like you're always aware. You're not really tuned in, and you're aware that you're not tuned in. This can make you very, very obsessed about trying to get it right. So this idea that neurotypicals are socially obsessed and autistics aren't is not true. It might apply to some autistic people, but it doesn't apply to all, and that's why it's a stereotype. And stereotypes are always, very suspect. As I say, all stereotypes contain a grain of truth. In other words, there are going to be a number of autistic people who don't care at all for the social world. There are going to be a number of autistic people who are very, very good at detail. But it doesn't mean that just because you're autistic, it follows that you're going to be really good at detail. There's nothing in the diagnostic criteria for autism that says you have to be really good at detail. That's just a kind of an associated trait, but it's not actually essential to the diagnosis, and having an extreme attention to detail isn't actually unique to autism. As I say, neurotypicals can also... look at all the scientists. Scientists, by definition, have an attention to detail. Doesn't mean they're autistic. Autism is a disability, and autism, certainly the autism I know, the Asperger's I experience, is a significant disability, and it does hold me back in life. I'm not a defeatist. I'm a realist. I do believe that given enough effort and determination, I can achieve great things. I could do great things. I'm always pushing against my condition all the time. I'm always trying to break through the barriers. I'm always trying new things to try and force myself to not be so rigid. So I don't believe that Asperger's. I'm not a determinist. I don't believe that just because you've got Asperger's, you can't achieve things. That you're somehow enchained by your condition. Far from it. That is not in my character at all. I'm a fighter, but I am a realist, and it is obvious. I'd be burying my head in the sand to say otherwise, that Asperger's is a disability. Obviously, if I didn't have Asperger's, my life would be a lot easier, and I'd probably be achieving far more. That's just reality. Yes, it sounds a bit depressing, but that is the reality. You can't choose the deck of cards you're handed in life. You can choose how you play them. So Asperger's is a disability, but how I deal with that disability, that's something that I can control, where I have choice over, to an extent. But as I say, we do need to get away from this notion that Asperger's is just a personality quirk and that it confers advantages, because that is really, really quite offensive to people like myself who generally do struggle day in, day out. It's not a game in a park. If a cure was around for Asperger's, an actual cure that didn't involve having to take medication for the rest of my life, or didn't involve something invasive, like if I could wave a magic wand and my difficulties would go away and I could find it easier to socialise and all the rest and do what I want to do, I'd take it. My personality wouldn't be altered. I'd still be the same gregarious, energetic person. I'd still be very interested in things. I still have a good vocabulary and all the rest, but I wouldn't have all these deficits, because Asperger's to me is defined by deficits, not by strengths.